Welcome to the podcast An Ancient Language for a Modern Soul, Poemi Conviviali by Giovanni Pascoli. I'm here with James Ackhurst again to talk about one of his favorite poems, The Old Men of Kea, which tells the story of two famous Greek athletes, Lacon and Panthis, in their old age. James is a poet and a writer based in New Zealand, and he has a background in classics. James and I co-translated Poemi Conviviali in 2022 for Italica Press, and the translation you hear is our own. The poem is read by George Sharpley and Joanna Strafford. The music has been composed by Giovanni Tardini and is played at the Celtic harp by Mark Harmer. The Old Men of Kea is a long poem made of 5 parts or 5 shorter poems. It has 2 protagonists, 2 old men, as the title indicates. They're called Lacon and Panthis, 2 former athletes from the Greek island of Kea. If you listen to other episodes in this series, you know that very rarely does Pascoli create his characters from scratch. In fact, even in this poem, Pascoli finds these 2 characters mentioned in the works of Bacchylides, a Greek lyric poet who lived between the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Now, it's interesting that Pascoli wrote this poem right after the publication in 1897 of 21 hymns by Bacchylides contained in the collection of Egyptian scrolls in the British Museum in London. It was a man called Frederick George Kenyon who published those hymns, and this publication caused quite a sensation in the circles of classicists and archaeologists. And we know that Pascoli actively participated in the scholarly debate over these texts. Well, in this poem, Pascoli slightly tweaks the characters. He makes Lacon much older than he is in Bacchylides' hymn, so that he can be the same age as Panthis, who was the father of an athlete in Bacchylides' corpus called Argeus. It's very complicated. So here we have Lacon and Panthis, 2 former athletes at the end of their lives, were also friends with each other. But before we listen to the first part, I'd like to ask James to tell us a bit about Bacchylides and why his poetry has to do with athletes.
Right, so Bacchylides is from the island of modern Kea, or Kea, as you said, which is ancient chaos. Chaos like C-E-O-S, not like chaos with a C-H, like the state of my flat at the moment. So he comes from Kea, and another famous person from Chios was Simonides. And some people might know Simonides as the author of the famous epitaph for the Spartans after Thermopylae, the one which is very laconic, very brief, and says, "Go tell the Spartans, you who pass us by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." So Simonides of Chios was a big deal poet, and Bacchylides was actually the nephew of Simonides. So we think Bacchylides' dates are around 520 to 450 BC. So they straddle the conventional divide between the archaic and the classical periods of Greek history. And the conventional dividing line between the archaic and the classical period is the Persian invasion of 480. So the Great Persian Wars of 480 and 479 BC, that's when the archaic period becomes the classical. And so like a poet that he's often compared to, Pindar, Bacchylides is both late archaic and early classical. Now, we know that there were 9 canonical lyric poets recognized by scholars in Hellenistic Alexandria and collected by them and edited by them. And Bacchylides, for almost 2,500 years, had the smallest amount of surviving material of all those poets. Just a few verses quoted by others, no complete poems by Bacchylides. And then, as Elena mentioned, in 1896, we have this papyrus that's discovered containing his book of Eponychia, or Victory Odes, which we'll talk about a lot more. That book of Eponychia or Victory Odes in complete form, and also half of his book on book of dithyrambs, so poems to or songs to Dionysus. And more later material was found from papyri from Egypt, no fewer than 15 different papyri. And so now we know a lot more about Bacchylides than we did, however many years that is, 120, 130 years ago or so. Bacchylides, we now know, wrote hymns to the gods called paeans. He wrote processional songs. He wrote parthenia, or maiden songs. He wrote dancing songs, or hippokamata, erotica, obviously love songs, and encomia, or songs of praise. So he had quite a variety. He was quite versatile, like a lot of these early lyric poets. But the most important genre for our purposes is the victory ode, the eponychion, Epinician poem. And like Pindar, Bacchylides wrote these for wealthy patrons. And these were generally aristocrats who took part in the great pan-Hellenic athletic competitions. And we're actually recording this while the Olympics is going on in Paris, so it's very topical. So, for example, one of the Epinician poems of Bacchylides is a celebration of Hero, as they sometimes call him, the tyrant of Syracuse. And Magna Graecia and Sicily, so the Greek cities in southern Italy and Sicily, had a longer tradition of actual kings, monarchs, and tyrants. Greeks often call them tyrants than other city-states. So even into the classical period, we get these figures who are kind of kings or monarchs over their city-states. So, so one of Bacchylides' Epinician poems celebrates this guy, Hero, and his victory at the horse race at Olympia in 576. That must be 476. And that's actually the same victory as Pindar celebrates in his first Olympian ode. So that's just, I gave that as an example because that's very typical of what these Epinician poems are like. They usually are in honor of a particular aristocrat who's associated with the ruling class in a particular city-state, or at least a high-up aristocratic class in some city-state. And they're in honor of victory in a particular event. So it could be the horse race, it could be the chariot race, it could be the wrestling, sprint, whatever, or the run in armor. There are all these different ancient athletic events. So anyway, that's what Bacchylides is all about. I mean, not all about. He has this versatility, but the main thing we remember him for now, we know him for now, is his Epinician poem. So like Pindar, he's almost up there with Pindar, the great author of these victory odes.
Great. So let's listen to the first poem.
In rocky Kea, up on the mountain between shining Eulys and ancient Carthaia, Panthis, the fated athlete, wandered, looking for herbs to allay some tireless malady, or maybe, who knows, for flowers for a festive banquet. Panthis, the athlete, now also a healer, master of the herbs that soothe. More likely, then, it was the herbs he was gathering. Flowery garlands don't go with white hair. He'd already set out from stony Eulys when dawn came on. Now the sun shone, and now he was nearly at the top of the mountain, which was covered with oaks, with an altar in the middle to the god who sends rain to parching Kea, with some playful thunder. Now he was there on the windy peak, where he suddenly noticed somebody coming up the other side. He recognized him, an old guest friend, a fellow athlete, Lacon, who had so many garlands hung up in his hall from Isthmia and Nemea, of laurel and olive, green when he'd won them, green no more. But his life had not been crowned with children. He lived alone and went along the untended ways, gathering herbs or flowers maybe for some happy feast, or to allay some stubborn illness. Herbs, more likely. Drawing up a bucket from an old stone well on his own each day had lined his aging face with wrinkles. And now Panthis was standing behind him. He still hadn't noticed him behind his back with a big bundle of twigs in his hands. Lacon felt his shadow on his neck like an itch and turned around, hiding his bundle behind him. Panthis smiled and held out his own. "Oh, I see. It isn't dill for a picnic, nor cumin, nor myrtle, nor is it celery. What it was a bunch of reddish stems with a spray of bright white flowers at the top. Then Lacon said, "Dear friend, the time has now crept upon us for hemlock. It's ancestral law. Those who can't live happily in Kea shouldn't live in pain." Panthis nodded. "Let's recall the message of the nightingale, whose song is flowing and sweet as honey. The lofty heavens can't be sullied, the limpid ocean can't rot, and old men can't pass through old age to pluck the flower of youth again." "Well then, let's find the flower of hemlock," Lacon said, with a smile, and added, "Gathering a whole bunch in a single day is no laughing matter for men of our age. But really, being human doesn't make much sense. From innocent childhood, every day, all we're really gathering are the flowers of death."
And so what we see here is that the two athletes are picking herbs, but not for cooking. They are picking hemlock, which is the same poisonous plant that was used to kill Socrates. The law quoted here is paraphrased from Menander, a Greek dramatist of the 4th and 3rd century before Christ. And he said, "Those who cannot live a good life should not live a bad one," which means they should rather die. The last lines also suggest that the idea that human beings are essentially defined by their mortality, and life, after all, is just a long illness that gets worse with time, and there is nothing that can be done to stop its progression. This first poem ends with a meditation on human mortality, but the next poem or part of the entire poem is called The Eternal Hymn. And in this poem, we are introduced to the Choregeion, the choir school, where a choir of boys used to gather to sing hymns. James, what was the Choregeion and what kind of poetry was sung there?
Well, the Choregeion just means sort of the chorus place, the chorus thing. And so it's the kind of the place where choral poetry was practiced. And often this was in the home of the choregos, which literally just means the leader of the chorus. And in democratic Athens, this became a kind of official job that the wealthy man had to do as a form of taxation, called a choregia. And their choruses would be the centerpiece of the tragedies or comedies that were put on during the Great Festival of Dionysus, which features 5 days of plays and ceremonies, 1 day of opening ceremonies and 3 days of tragedies, and one final day where they have 5 comedies. And the choruses would often have elaborate costumes. So you might think of Aristophanes' plays, which are the only surviving 5th century tragedy that we have. And they often have these animal choruses. So the frogs, the birds, obviously they had choruses of frogs and birds, also the clouds. And so that's not animals, but you get the idea that these choruses would have been, they would have had amazing costumes, and people would have come partly to see these costumes. And that was one of the main expenses. But of course, they would not only have these amazing costumes, they would also be able to sing and dance in time, and they would be singing these lyric odes of Aristophanes and other poets, as well as kind of reciting some of the lines in different meters. So it would be kind of like modern opera, which is, of course, based on ancient drama, where people would be singing and also sometimes speaking or reciting, but also with the element of dance. And, 12 or 15 people in tragedies. In comedies, 24 people in the chorus dancing together. Okay, so let's just back up a bit and talk about choral poetry and choruses in the Archaic period, because that's classical Athens. And that actually is something that comes out of the tradition that begins somewhere in the mists of Dark Age Greece. So when we start having information and getting information about Greek culture in the Iron Age, end of the Dark Age, early Archaic period, whatever you want to call it, around the 8th century BC into the 7th and 6th centuries BC, we find these choruses. So they're a feature of Greek social life all over archaic Greece, and they usually involve groups of young people, and often single-sex groups, so all boys or all girls. And this is when that genre of parthenia, maiden song, starts to make a bit more sense. These are songs, involving performances by young girls. And as in the choruses of ancient classical Athenian drama, these choruses are usually singing and we assume dancing as well. And so they've been studied as a kind of rite of passage, actually, by anthropologically minded classicists. A lot of adolescents seem to move through this period of dancing and singing together. It's a kind of socialization ritual. They become part of the polis. All right, so one traditional distinction is between choral lyric poetry and monodic lyric. So two types of lyric poetry, basically, in archaic Greece. There's lots of different ways of categorizing this. People argue about this, but basically, one distinction that's long been drawn is, choral poetry and monodic lyric poetry, with the former being sung by choruses and the latter by single individual. That's why it's called monodic. One singer, one song. And so the monodic poems usually have a kind of I in them, but even that scholars now think we should take with a pinch of salt. You never really know who was writing the poem and who was performing them back in the day, whether it was one person or many. But anyway, that's the broad distinction. So let's talk about choral poems. So most of the choral poems that we have are essentially religious songs. They're songs of praise, either to Apollo, in which case they're called paeans, or to Dionysus, in which case they're called dithyrambs. They could be processional songs, episodia. They could be maiden songs, partheneia. They could be wedding songs, hymeneia. They could be dirges or requiems called threnoi. And we've seen that Bacchylides writes most of these types, so at least we have poems that Bacchylides writes, which are examples of each of these genres, or most of these genres. Now, by the end of the Archaic period, we get this secularization of choral songs, with aristocrats or kings being praised rather than the gods. And one subset of this genre is the victriode that we just talked about of Pindar and Simonides of Chios and Bacchylides of Chios. And as we've seen, these are usually in praise of aristocrats who've just been victorious at one of the great Pan-Hellenic athletic competitions. Choral lyric is most closely associated with the Doric areas of Greece. So if listeners don't know, in ancient Greece, there were different cultural areas. The Greeks perceived themselves as kind of diverse, I guess. There are other groups, but the most important ones, I suppose, are the Doric and the Ionians and Dorians. So the cities which were Dorian are more closely associated with choral lyric, although Simonides and Bacchylides are actually an exception to this, because they're from Chaos. But you think of other poets like Alcman, who's from Sparta. A lot of them come from Doric city-states. Despite this, the Greek that's used in these choral poems, they tend not to be pure Doric. They tend to be this weird mixture of Doric, West Greek, Iolic, so other Greek dialects, and also Homeric, which is itself a kind of amalgam, sort of Pan-Hellenic mix of different Greek dialects. So you don't need to go into the details of that, probably because I don't think I remember them, but the point is that these poems were written in a language that would have sounded highly stylized, even to contemporary listeners and contemporary readers. It's definitely, by the classical period, they would have sounded stylized. And in Athenian plays, when they have these choral odes, they're actually written in this weird sort of choral language to sort of give them a heightened feeling. There's a sense that they're from a long ago time, and they're sort of special. They're written in sort of special language. A choral lyric is also usually strophic in form. So that means that there are these pairs of so-called strophes, which are just stanzas, and they're two stanzas with the same meters. So you have one stanza, with the same meter, and then there's a sort of break, and then there's another stanza with different words, but and they kind of answer each other. They answer one another. So each strophe is met by an equivalent antistrophe. And the usual assumption is that this reflected some kind of dance moves or some kind of pattern in the dances, turns or repetitions of certain dance sequences by the choruses. And that's another feature that goes into classical Athenian drama. You get this so-called responsion, the echo of the strophe by the antistrophe. So it's actually kind of an interesting genre in its own right, choral lyric, and it has this long history. And so Pascali knows all of this, and he's trying to pick up on all these things.
Great. That's fascinating. Let's listen to part 2.
they sat down in the shade of a spreading oak tree, one next to the other. Out in the distance, between hilly vineyards, was a fertile valley, already blonde with ripening barley. Women were bringing in the harvest, singing as they worked, and their song was echoed by the clacking chatter of the crickets all through the sun-drenched vines. In the perfect absence called the sky, there was another echo. Two old men talking about Corinth, where there's apparently a temple with young priestesses who are very kind to guests. Down in the valley they could see Carthia, a white flock of sheep that had been lulled to sleep by the cricket's familiar lullaby. The sea was behind it, with here and there a sail or two, like a field of blue linen with sunspots of snowy, miraculous lilies. Between the sea and the sky, halfway up a cliff, there was a chorus of singers, a buzzing crowd nested in a hive of marble. Phrygian pipes and Dorian lyres sounded together in a hubbub that was like the hullabaloo of birds on high, or the endless thrashing of the canopy. They were singing an inspiring song in praise of a runner, a champion. The song went down 100 alleys, searching for the past, digging out old memories, then flew up to the sky, dove down in the sea, met the souls of the dead in the underworld, and then it came back, drunk with joy. Drunk with tears, it came back again to crown the champion with a garland of leaves. The two old men were far away. All they could see was the glare of the marble. But the sound of the singing still reached them there. It reached their hearts, or had been there all along. The sun was bringing in the day from the east with songs and all the notes of life, bringing it over to its grave decline, when night comes on in his cloak of planets, bringing dreams and echoes, echoes of songs. So daylight ebbed and dark flowed in. And beneath night and daylight, sun and shadow, hope and dream, the earth remained. But the chorus moved to a quicker tempo. For every wave that crashed on the shore, another was there to take its place. It was death and life, an individual wave rising and shining, then crashing down in an ocean that moaned without measure or end. Life after life, rising and falling in the endless sea, an eternal song. And out of eternity came other waves, like progeny, which then gave birth to further waves, more progeny, and waves and waves and waves and waves.
So the eternal hymn in this part of the poem is to be seen as a juxtaposition to the finitude of each individual human life. There's this great metaphor of the sea waves that dissolve only to be replaced by new ones continuously and endlessly. And so this image sort of introduces the main concept in the next part of this poem, where Panthis proudly talks about his progeny. Just like the waves in the ocean, generations follow each other. So each individual life ends, but life itself continues, which is why the next part is called ephemeros, from the word ephemerios in Greek, which means on one day. So each life lasts but one day, but life itself is endless, at least for those like Panthis who have children. Panthis is the father of Argius, a famous athlete, and he even has a grandchild, whereas Lacon is childless. Let's listen to now part 3.
Panthis said, "My friend, as you know, I have 5 sons, all renowned. Zelotus is the eldest, young Argius, who is good at fighting, even though the hair is only now blossoming at his lip. Strong Argius is the youngest, and he's the one at Isthmia now, competing in the famous games. Listen, Lacon. Yesterday I heard a cry in the house at the break of day, a muffled sobbing, which called me to the bedroom of my eldest son. I went in and saw a light, a brand new, shining little man clutching up at me with his hands, as if to say, "Here is a torch, lit from a torch that you once lit. There's no harm now if yours goes out. I'm the new Panthis. You can go, Grandad." When he'd spoken his mind, he smacked his lips, obviously satisfied. So should I keep my lips to the fountain, old as I am, stopping my grandson from getting a drink? Should I be slobbering in his water? I'm off, but not dying, because I'm him. Lacon replied, "Oh, I would love for a tiny light to dance in my eyes. I wouldn't mind shielding someone else from the winter winds. I'd be happy to sit for a little while longer by the fountain of life, not to take a sip myself, but to look on as a little guy puckered up to his mother's breast. I think you're dying more than me." They fell silent, content to listen to the internal song, the song of the breath, a wave that comes along, then goes. The harvesters were singing again in the blonde barley, and their song was echoed by the clacking chatter of the crickets. Then Lacon said, "Holy Kea, splendid island, why would anyone born on you ever want to die elsewhere? A tiny place, but loved by many." Panthis replied, "Tiny is right, but tiny Delos exiles its children as soon as they're dead. The dead depart from the holy island on a black ship. Exiles, marvellously pale, they travel over the sounding sea to Renia, then lie down and sleep, while solitary goats and sheep wander, bleating over their graves." Lacon was thinking. His face leant pensively on his open palm. "Oh, I can remember a song," he said, "from years ago in holy Delphi, by the banks of the Alpheus. We last but one day, one or none. Man is the dream of a shadow, no more." His shadow leant his head on his hand. A man was thinking underneath a tree, alone, with the sound of shadows rustling where there had been leaves.
So in the last poems, we will see the two men part ways and go home. And each of the two poems recounts each man's way home. As they go home, the choir sings, and each man listens to a hymn sung by the choir, a hymn which is written for them. So in part 4, the hymn celebrates Lacon, and in part 5, the hymn celebrates Argius, Panthis' son. So both men go home happy and ready to die. Now, those hymns are interesting from a poetic perspective. Pascali wrote that he invented Lacon's hymn himself, but that Argius' hymn is a translation of Bacchylides' hymn too, although it is a free translation, so he says. So these hymns are epinikia, which is the plural of epinikion, which James mentioned before. Pascoli kept sort of the metric structure of this poetic genre, and we also kept it in our translation. James, can you tell us about this particular type of hymn, the epinikion?
Okay, so an epinikion, as we've mentioned before, is a victory ode. So this actually comes from Greek as well, obviously. So you just mentioned ephemerals from epihemeros. So that word epi, on or in, it's the same word here, but this time it's epinike, so it's on victory. Nike, people might know about the Nike sportswear brand, which was named after Nike Athena, which is a deity of victory. So yeah, so an epinikion is a victory ode. It's a song composed in honor of somebody, invariably an aristocratic athletic male, who has been victorious at one of the great pan-Hellenic athletic competitions. And there were 4 of these in the sort of canon and the sort of tour. And they took part, year after year. So you could do a sort of circuit. And these were Olympia, obviously the most famous ones. We now have the Olympic Games named after those. Also at Nemea, at Isthmia, and at Delphi. And the games at Delphi are actually called the Pythian Games in honor of Apollo, the Python slayer. In Pindar's case, we actually have poems he composed about victories in all of these sets of games, all of these athletic competitions, so that scholars have been able to refer to Pindar's poems as the first Olympian ode, the second Pythian ode, etc., or just Olympian 1, Nemean 2, and so on. The writers of Epinician odes do sometimes refer to them as hymns, humnoi, however, and there's a theory that these Epinician odes evolved from hymns describing the feats of Heracles. So first of all, they're kind of normal hymns to gods, then they become hymns to sort of demigods like Heracles, and then they get to these aristocratic families who usually claim that they descend ultimately from gods. So it's not too big of a leap. The earliest epinikia, as we mentioned, are those of Simonides of Chios. And even though Pindar is now considered and really known as the kind of king of the epinikion, we should bear in mind that's partly because we didn't have any complete poems by Bacchylides until quite recently. So Pindar's kind of had the field sort of to himself for a long time. But Bacchylides is the nephew of the earliest Epinician poet that we know of, Simonides, and he should be considered a really interesting and successful writer of epinikia in his own right. So I think that people who work on or study Bacchylides are always kind of living in the shadow of Pindar, and they're always trying to say, no, actually Bacchylides is a really interesting poet in his own right. And I think that's quite right. We shouldn't really, we're doing it now already, but we shouldn't really consider him just like he's another Pindar. He's almost as good as Pindar. He's actually a very successful Epinician poet in his own right. And we only really have, this a perception of him as kind of trying to catch up with Pindar because of this accident that we had so much Pindar for so long and very little Bacchylides. Anyway, so Pascal's is again showing that he really knows his stuff by setting his poem about Epinician poetry and athletics on the island of Chaos.
Let's listen to part 4.
The old men gathered their bundles of twigs and got up to go. They said to each other, "Go well, my friend," then headed home, picking the fatal flowers on the way. The smell of herbs was in the air, the tang of thyme and the sweetness of honey. Lacon came to the sanctuary of Apollo, to the choral school. It was already evening. He heard some children calling his name, children at play, but who wanted to sing the ancient song the grown-ups sang, that everyone on Kea held in their hearts. Soon, a hip-high chorus leader had his singers in a line, and the chorus was moving like the sun towards the sunset as the gulls cawed.
Coming of age, the secret energy that quickens without any tremor or murmur, and that surreptitiously covers over each dead stone with the green moss. Let Lacon consecrate to you the green celery from wooded Nemea.
He knew the song, a song they'd sung back in the days his fate was unwritten. How many years had passed since then? Now they were swinging back from the west towards the east like the planets at night.
But nothing stays. There isn't anything that's stable. It runs, my young champion runner, the way you run through the stadium, quick as the wind with your fleet foot. And so you brought your trophy home, the green celery to windy Kea.
The boys turned back the other way, their eyes fixed on where the sky meets sea, their feet planted on the holy island as they lifted their boyish voices in song.
Now, though, is the time for love. Is the green celery all that you want? One day, other young men will run the races that Lakon can run no longer. Young men breathing the same spirit, his, yours, along the Alpheus River.
The boys looked up, and there was Lakon, old Lakon with his celery crown. They ran up to him and swarmed around him, shouting, "Give me the crown! I want a crown!"
And now let's listen to part 5.
Panthis had now arrived beneath high-up Euless, where he was born. Out at sea, he saw a ship drawing near, dropping sail, making its way into the harbour. From high up Euless, the people came down past the stone lion crouched on the slope, along the river, and down to the sea. The boys were first, running ahead, their curly hair flowing in the breeze. Next came the women, high-bosomed, then finally the old, limping down, sharing some gossip along the way. The ship from Isthmia had come, bringing the athletes back home with an unknown number of victory garlands. Panthis came down to the shore as well, holding his bundle of twigs to his breast. He stood to one side, and now from the ship a whole row of youths descended, their dark hair blossoming with flowers, and lined up along the sounding beach. One of them sat on a toppled column and played a lyre, while all around him others brought long flutes to their lips. And the eternal sea alternately swelled the waves and let them crash, up and down, a sigh and a song. The flutes sounded, the lyre rang out, and the chorus sang Bacchylides, with the sea sighing behind them. Panthis stood there, a little to one side, his bundle shaking to the beat of his heart. Waves rose and waves fell. The chorus formed a circle on the sounding shore.
Holy Kea! Now glorious fame approaches you with a messenger rich in grace. In the famous foot race, Argius took the prize. And we re-echo the praise he won on Isthmia's land. We lads of Kea, loved by the gods, we adorned with flowery garlands 70-odd. And now the glorious song our native muse composed sounds from the flute and lyre, so we can honour with an ode Argius, the victor, Panthis, his sire.
Panthis listened, and his heart beat wildly, rattling the twigs he held to his chest. Now he could let go of life contentedly, the way a man might gather a bundle of herbs all day and then unbundle it at home at night to make himself a garland. Not one of his 5 sons would leave the earth without some athlete's glory. The sun had blessed him. Fate had granted what's best for a man. Highly esteemed among mortal men, he went back home to grind his herbs, the skilled healer, in a bronze mortar. The night was sweet, the night was golden, and his heart was at peace. Little Panthis had settled down at his mother's breast, and strong Argios, all tired out with happiness and the long trip home, was already dreaming of other grounds. How kind fate was. The only thing it had ever denied him was to climb up into the realms of the gods.
Great. Oh, thank you very much, James. For me, I love this poem because ultimately it contains the same message about life and death as the first one that we did with you, actually. Solon, a well-spent life implies a better acceptance of death. Like Leonardo da Vinci famously said in his motto about wanting to sleep after a good day's work and being willing to die after a productive life. And the poem also reminds me somehow of Solomon in the Bible, who's said to have died full of years, riches and honor. In the Old Men of Kea, it's not just glory and good deeds that make our life worth living, but also having offspring, having someone to continue life after we've gone.
That's right. I mean, I think this is an incredibly Greek poem. I mean, obviously, Pascali knows a lot about the Greeks, and he's very learned, and he strives to kind of incorporate them and get the pith and the spirit of them in most of the poems of the Poemi Conviviali and in other works as well. But this one kind of really stands out for me just for the knowledge of Epinician, for the way that he does sort of such a good impersonation / adaptation of Bacchylides. And I think it's a bit of a flex, as they say. It'd be too obvious going for Pindar. He's going to give you something a little bit more recherché. And I think just the sort of the whole atmosphere of this poem is incredibly Greek. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that it's actually a little bit, it's a bit of a downer, you'd say nowadays, because it's about these guys who are going to die. And that might seem a bit strange to us. I mean, Pascali can be a little bit melancholy, but I think this is also something that comes out of the Greek texts. I mean, there's a famous part of someone in Sophocles' play who says, the best thing is never to have been born. Second best thing is to die as quickly as you can. So for the Greeks, there was actually the strange sense that because life is full of tragedy, it can actually be a good thing to have kind of a death well achieved. And there's also this idea that a happy life is never complete until you've actually met your end. So when we did the last episode about Solon, I think we told the story already, right, of Solon and Croesus of Lydia, the richest man in the world. And Croesus of Lydia said to Solon, who's the happiest man? Who's the most eudaimon man? Who's the most successful man? Expecting Solon was going to say, well, you obviously, you've got all these Ferraris and stuff. But actually he said, there's this guy in Athens who fought for his country and died, and he had grandchildren, and he was an honored man in his community, and he's the happiest. And Croesus said, okay, who's next? Expecting again that it would be him. And then that's when Solon brings in the story of these guys, Cleobus and Biton. And I told the story before, but the relevant point here is that they drag their mother to the sanctuary of Hera. The mother says, my young sons are so good to me. And she prays to the goddess to bring them the happiest thing, the best thing possible for mortals. And what happens is that Hera kills them. It's a very strange thing to read if you're someone who's not in ancient Greek. But the whole point of what Solon's trying to tell Croesus, though, is that you never know that your life is complete, that you're never really safe in your prosperity until you die. So in some ways, you can see it from that angle, that it kind of sets the seal on a life well lived. And so these two old guys, it might seem a bit kind of sad that they're reaching the end of their lives, but the point is they've done what they've done. It's included athletics, and one guy's case at least has included children, and now this is going to set the seal on it. So, and that's the kind of melancholy, but almost sort of complete and sort of it's an atmosphere of sort of fulfillment, I think, is the idea.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, thank you, James, for this conversation. That was super interesting, I thought. And then thank you, everyone, for listening.